Kimberly Stewart's here. She says hello. So there's 5 people watching now, so I think we can get started if you'd like.
Okay. Good afternoon, and welcome to our Women's History Month celebration with a panel discussion on women leaders in higher education beyond breaking the glass ceiling. My name is Mary Lou Jackson. I am the Assistant to the President for Mission, and I will act as your moderator today. This session is being live streamed and recorded. Please feel free to use the YouTube chat box to ask questions of our panelists. We will reserve the last 15 minutes of our time together for questions and answers. So what do we mean by glass ceiling, or a more recent iterative, concrete ceiling? A glass ceiling is a metaphor used to represent an invisible barrier that prevents a given demographic, typically applied to women, from rising beyond a certain level in a hierarchy. The metaphor was first coined by feminists in reference to barriers in careers of high-achieving women. In fact, it was coined in 1978 by Marilyn Loden, who was quoted as saying at a women's exposition in New York, as she reflected upon her own experience, "It seemed to me there was an invisible barrier to advancement that people didn't recognize." That day, Loden referred to it as the glass ceiling. While the glass ceiling originally referred to women in general, it's clear that women of color face an even tougher barrier, a concrete ceiling. This term was coined in 2016 by Jasmine Babbers to describe the significantly tougher hurdle women of color face in reaching elevated success in their careers. And so today, we will ask our own very much admired leaders, President Tony Hayes, Vice President for Academic Affairs Mary Driscoll, and Associate Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer Audrey Grace, how they have broken the glass, the concrete, to become the leaders they are at Regis today. And so with that, why don't we begin by asking them to share their own stories, their trajectories of leadership to where they are right now at Regis. President Hayes, would you like to begin?
Well, thank you so much, Mary Lou, and thank you for having me here. I'm honored to be asked. I had the questions in advance, so I had a chance to do some thinking about it. But just my story is that I went to nursing school, graduating from nursing school and from Boston College, and I was very much empowered. I was a very much empowered young woman at 21 because of the education I had at Boston College. But I also would say to you that I also had chosen a field of practice that wasn't a particularly popular area. I chose the field of gerontology and geriatrics. And as a result, I went into the field and very quickly rose up in the ladder in that world, because there were very few baccalaureate prepared nurses even working in the field of geriatrics. But because of the fact that I was there, I began already at 21 questioning why we do things the way we do them. So at 21, I was already asking the questions why, and wanted to be a change agent. Now, I had never thought of myself as a change agent at that point in my life, but it was clear to me that I wasn't satisfied with the quality of care that the elderly were receiving, and I wanted to make a difference and change that reality. So I wasn't very popular, and I had to learn a lot because of that. I rattled a lot of cages, and I sacrificed a popularity that was at one point in my life very, very important. However, I pursued more education, and as a result of that, I had many doors opened. I was one of the very first geriatric nurse practitioners in the United States with a master's degree, and I was pursued by several large higher ed institutions to launch their geriatric nurse practitioner programs. I was recruited by Columbia and BU. Being a Boston girl, I decided, I should say Boston woman, I decided to stay in Boston and was very involved in the development of the master's program in geriatrics at the Boston University School of Nursing. At the same time, I received an opportunity to teach at Boston University School of Medicine. Again, these were not part of my plan. I loved geriatrics, But because I wanted to make a difference, I found myself wanting to earn more credentials so that I would have more of a voice and be able to impact change in the care of the older adult. Well, that got me into the higher ed world, and the higher ed world promoted me because, again, I didn't have a lot of competition, but I also was a voice. And but I began to learn how change could be done differently than aggressively. And I had been quite aggressive between my ages of 20 and 25, very, very concerned that change was so difficult to make. So I had to learn that making change really required consensus building. It required taking the time to really get to know the as I refer to them, is the informal power people, because I wanted to be sure that I could bring around consensus that change needed to happen. I began to become more successful because of that in making change. So I had to learn the hard way that change has to be something where you draw people together, and the vision that you have, people have to be able to buy into. So fast forward, I continued teaching both at Boston University School of Medicine and Nursing, and also BU Boston College School of the Wood School, actually teaching the part-time evening degree students the world of gerontology. Then family came, and it was time to start my doctoral program. And it took me a while to find the right doctoral program that would, again, give me the courage and the strength to continue to make changes in the world of gerontology and geriatrics from a policy perspective. Regis opened up their nursing program. I was missing teaching, but also I was doing consulting, and started my own consulting business, working with various hospitals and higher ed institutions in the world of gerontology. So again, moving quickly through that was my world. My world was trying to change things in the world of geriatrics. I come to Regis and learned a whole new world of teaching the adult student. And then I began to realize how important it was to start to make sure that we opened opportunities for adult learners. Moved on to creating and working with the administration of Regis to build the master's program in nursing, but always building in gerontology curriculum. I can just say to you that the world of consensus building is probably what has given me the greatest opportunities, but also being willing to step out of the box, question my reality, question the reality of others, and truly trying very hard to make a difference at the end of the day, because we need to make a difference in this world, and the world that we live in often is not supportive of those people who are marginalized, which includes both our adult learner population, who are frequently people of color, people who didn't have opportunities, but that goes along as well with people who are older. So that's my story. It starts with working for the geriatric population on through working for the adult learner.
And eventually teaching, then being a dean, and then a president.
Always teaching and being committed to what was right. And committed for me to become the president of Regis was certainly not part of my plan. But when the opportunity arose and I had people ask me to consider throwing my hat in the ring, I thought so deeply about it that yes, I love this institution, and I wanted to be involved in helping to make a difference in taking Regis to another level and bringing Regis into the 21st century.
Thank you, Tony. That was beautiful. Mary.
Thank you, Tony. That was beautiful. I did enjoy that. And thank you very much for having me today. As the president said, I too am honored to be asked. and have thought a little bit about it. I started out life as a music major. I did a lot of choral work with groups, and after going to the Ursuline School in New Rochelle, went to Connecticut College. And after that, went to Sarah Lawrence. And both Connecticut, Ursuline was a school for women, young women. Connecticut had a long history of being Connecticut College for Women before it was Connecticut College. It had gone co-ed by the time I got there, as had Sarah Lawrence, but it was founded about the same time as Regis as a school for young women. And they all had long histories of strong women in leadership. So I worked for a little bit as an early childhood music teacher and then as a high school music teacher in a school for young women run by the Ursulines in the Bronx. And when I decided to go into educational administration, I wrote back for transcript or whatever I needed at Connecticut College. And the director of career services, wonderful woman named Betsy James, said, "I think you're very brave." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Well, that's that there aren't a lot of women in the profession of educational administration." Of course, that hadn't been my world at all. I thought women could do anything and that they ran the world. And in the world that I had known up to that point, they pretty much did. I found out otherwise at the University of Chicago. It was not at the time in any way. I was in a doctoral program in administration, education, and policy studies. I don't believe I ever had a female professor. There were very few women in the cohort. It was a white male profession at all levels. And so although teaching was still a very heavily feminized profession, still is in terms of teacher ranks, it was the coaches and the deans of disciplines that became the principals and moved ahead. And the same thing was true in the doctoral faculty. So I had thought I wanted to be a principal. I ended up really loving the research world and wanting to be part of the higher education field in educational policy and leadership. And for the first two institutions that I worked at, the University of Illinois at Chicago, and then at NYU and what became the Steinhardt School in Educational Leadership, I was the only female professor. In one case, the first hired, and the other the second, and the first had left, which was not exactly encouraging. That said, I had a lot of help and a lot of mentors along the way. I came into the profession at a time when it was really, when the profession was beginning to grapple with the fact that there was really something, askew. And so I landed some opportunities that I think would not have otherwise been there. And it's interesting, there was a wonderful play about 25 years back, I guess, maybe more than that, Heidi Chronicles by Wendy Wasserstein. And it's like the generations of feminism. And she's the heroine of it, Heidi, is a trailblazer. And then the women that come just after her have absolutely no idea what she had to do to get where she is. And I kind of feel like I'm in that generation, that there were people that opened doors for me. But there are things that are now commonplace in institutions that were not in any way, shape, or form present in the early days of my career. There's very little support for women who want to have families. No such thing as family leave for anybody. And you can still see that in people at my sort of age and stage in certain professions. In the sciences, women are still vastly underrepresented because in science and engineering, that still hasn't changed as much as it needs to. Education was one of the places that was, not surprisingly, a little bit friendlier to people making different kinds of life choices and figuring out how to balance work and life. But even then, the research expectations for tenure and all of that really meant that it had to be a fairly singular focus. So again, I benefited from a lot of networks of people and women in the field that were always giving one another a leg up and helping one another in professional associations. I stayed at NYU 21 years, and that's a big enough institution that you can reinvent yourself a couple of times. And I did. I moved from an assistant professorship through the ranks to tenure, and I was eventually chair of the department. I had opportunity for presidency and board membership on major professional organizations and journals, all of which were tremendous learning experiences. I can appreciate, although I don't think I even fully understand, people that are coming from underrepresented groups even today, the pressures that are put on them to achieve at very high levels and at the same time to represent, and pressures that I think some women felt when we were a little bit more singular in some of these male-dominated institutions. But it is a different kind of pressure than I think many of the colleagues that I grew up with ever experienced. Maybe they had pressures I didn't know
Mhm.
about, but that's definitely one. I was, after I had been chair for a while at the NYU, I was asked to apply for the deanship at the School of Education um, at at City College in New York, which is one of the oldest institutions in New York, part of the City University. And one of the former deans walked into my office about 3 weeks after I was there, and he said, "Do you realize you're the first woman that's been permanently appointed to this position?" And that was sort of stunning to me. That was 2012.
Mhm.
Anyway, I had 8 great years at City College, and about a year ago, my story came to Regis to work with these wonderful people, and in the midst of a pandemic. So I'm very grateful for all of the opportunities I've had. I have been part of and watched a profession change and open up. It's not open enough for all. It has a long way to go. But it is the accretion of years of opportunities and networks and people helping one another that actually makes that difference, along with some fairly strong policies and legislations that are needed as well.
Mhm.
So that's my story.
Great.
That was
Thank you,
great, Mary. Thank you.
Yes, yes, thank you, Mary. Audrey Grace, both actually Mary and Audrey started in March of last year, right when we were locking down. And they, needless to say, had no other choice but to hit the ground running. And they did. They truly did.
Yeah, time flies when you're having fun, right?
They
Yes.
hit the
Here we
ground
are.
zooming. They hit the
Yes.
ground zooming.
Zooming.
Time,
That's
time
right.
zooms.
Absolutely, Tony.
Yeah.
Yeah, so for my leadership journey, I mean, I feel like if this were the board game of life, I'm at the beginning, the start of that board game of life in terms of my leadership journey. So, I was a student leader in high school and college, and I found that, and it was, I don't know if I became a student leader because I wanted to lead or because someone saw something in me and said, you're a troublemaker, so let's be a little bit more constructive about all of your critiques of what we're doing here, and sort of directed me in that position. And I learned quickly about myself that I like to be engaged. I like to be busy. And whenever I have some sort of lull in my life and I pick something new up, and it tends to be a leadership type role or position. I mean, so someone called me ambitious one time, and that was the time before Ambitious Girl came out, and Kamala Harris, people were calling ambitious as a bad thing. And so I was taken aback by that, because I don't see my sort of career progression as pursuing some sort of higher goal or senior leadership position, but just what the work I like to do and the positions that open up that allow me to do so. So in this role, and particularly in diversity work, it's a lot of leadership without authority, in the sense of to what President Hayes was sharing about consensus building, and bringing people together around shared values. And I see that work here at Regis, and it's wonderful to work here where the shared values are so apparent, and it's frankly much more empowering to lead without authority in this situation. But I'm also involved in town politics in my town, so it's fascinating to see sort of the stark difference in treatment. So I found in higher ed, I do identify as Black or African American, or I'm biracial. So I also benefit from colorism, and I think that has been, part of my success in my career progression advancement, particularly because I've only been in higher ed for 5 years, and I think that's been a benefit to me, and it has been my whole life. I don't see that same benefit in town politics, and it is where you don't have those shared values or a sense of direction, just to see sort of different challenges to effectuating change in those areas, and some of the pushback I get there in town politics. But, you know, I've also had the benefit of throughout my career having several wonderful role models as leaders. And I'm very good at plagiarizing. If you haven't met me yet, I do admit that I like to go to people's presentations. I like to watch people's leadership styles, and I like to take from them what I think are effective traits or tactics. And it's sort of this, they don't know they're mentoring me. I secretly steal their style. And so, you know, I've been able to learn from people's leadership styles and to utilize those in my own work and what is most authentic to me. And a lot of those are things like, don't be afraid to admit when you're wrong or you don't know something. I think a lot of times I've seen higher ed that there's this sense of, you know, you have to be the expert in all things, but the most effective leaders I've seen are ones that are okay admitting they're wrong. And so that has the humility that comes with it has been part of my leadership journey today. But again, I'm at the beginning of the board game of life. Maybe not in the beginning, let's say like a healthy middle, I would say. And so I'm interested to see where my leadership journey will take me from here.
So Audrey, you actually start to talk about some of your self-understanding of your leadership style. So I'd like to talk a little bit about feminist theory, a little bit of one in particular. So feminist theorists have often referred to women's leadership as women's ways of knowing. That is an unwillingness to give up one's own self-definition. Rather, women leaders trust their own experiences, they trust their own instincts and skills and language and ways of knowing, not to only transform, but also to enrich an institutional culture. So in other words, there's this authenticity in both voice and vision. So does this theory or these theories resonate with your self-understanding of leadership? And maybe Audrey, I'll ask you to kind of continue on the same thought
Sure.
process you ended with about your own understanding of leadership.
Sure. Yes, that resonates with me. And I think maybe because my leadership journey is still developing, the understanding that knowledge isn't absolute, and understanding that, you know, we have shared values and I have value to bring to the table. And that does resonate with me, that aspect of women's ways of knowing. And sometimes though, what I feel on the inside does not manifest itself in how I intervene or speak on the outside. So there's sort of some development I'm still doing there, but I do think that I know when I'm making that decision not to speak up.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. President Hayes?
Well, I thought about that and I said, you know, for me, a way of knowing is relationships. So, you know, over the years, my leadership style has been very much built on relationships and the importance of relationships in leading. And so that's my way of knowing, is the importance of that. And I learned so much from relationships. And I am not a solo. I'm not a solo in the way I lead. I also believe that one of the things that I've always had is a very strong emotional intelligence. My husband used to say, "You're like the honeybee that flies around and you tend to pick up things around people that no one else notices." And I never thought about it that way, but I do know that emotional intelligence has been a very important part of my leadership and helps me in my leadership. Now, maybe I'm not always as good at it, but it's something that I pay attention to as I move forward in terms of leading in encouragement and mentoring others. That's also incredibly important aspect of my leadership and the way my womanhood directs the way I lead.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all I need to say about that.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Mary?
So about the same time that the book you're referencing, Women's Way of Knowing, came out, and I was in graduate school at the time, so it was very hot, right? There was an equally influential book, I think, Carol Gilligan's In a Different Voice. And for those of you that aren't familiar, she was working as an assistant to Larry Kohlberg in the moral development process at Harvard. And much like Piaget, when he was studying kids taking the Stanford Binet in the 20s, she noticed that the women kept getting consistently wrong answers according to the scale, but they were the same. And they focused much more on relationship in evaluating these moral dilemmas. And it was like these series of stories and stuff. And from there, she really did an extensive study of and later of adolescent girls that sort of basically was saying women do tend to focus on relationships. And I think the influential piece of that for me was that there were multiple ways of thinking about problems. And in my field, much of leadership and certainly much of educational administration in a school or a clinical setting is problem solving. I mean, that's kind of what you do all day. And so you can't have any better tool than to have multiple ways of looking at it. And I think it took a long time to privilege ways that were not just as sort of logical or rational or all of the things that, you know, in those days got you a great SAT score. But I think that touchstone has been very important as I've looked at not only the work around me in my various, you know, professional settings, but to be truth, life settings as well. You know, I mean, you make decisions based on all kinds of pieces of information and different ways of perspective on that. And so I think that's probably pretty true to who I am too.
Mm-hmm. So you've all alluded a little bit to your personal values and really the degree to which they influence how you lead. Could you go a little bit deeper there and share, you know, how those personal values really influence you in your day-to-day work? And then at the end of the day, where do you find strength to just, you know, when you've had a bad day, how do you keep going? Where do you find the strength? So Mary, why don't I start with you this time?
You know, the word, when you were talking about this, I thought about this too. And I think, you know, at one level, I think in terms of, you know, the thing that draws us all to Regis, I think is the commitment to mission, right? That we all share that. And some, like President Hayes, are long timers here, and two of us are much newer, and you're kind of in the middle, Mary Lou. But I think that is definitely your fundamental values about what you believe is important as you get, especially as you get older and you choose professional opportunities. That just gets more and more and more important, that the work is meaningful and that what you're doing. I also think on a day-to-day level, authenticity is absolutely key. And I think at the time, remember there was a feminist scholar working with at Chicago, and she said, you know, part of the reason that it's difficult to make truly feminist laws is we don't all agree on what they should look like. We don't all agree on what we want the world to look like, because is equal same or is equal looking different or all that kind of stuff. And I think for a lot of people starting out, the only way to be successful in a underrepresented profession was to mimic the behaviors of the people who were successful. And so you had very few women that I think would embrace their femininity or share personal details of their life or all of those, because it wasn't the successful model. And I do think that is, you know, that has lessened, if not disappeared. But I think it's underscored the value of authenticity. You can't really be somebody else. You can only be yourself. So that's got to be at the core of leadership. And that's what people respect, I think.
What you just said, Mary, reminds me of us when I interviewed a dean at a Catholic college for my dissertation. And one of the things that she said to me, she remarked and said, you know, when I'm sitting in a meeting and I'm the only woman, and I say I'm going to be late tomorrow for the meeting because I have to bring my son or daughter to wherever, might be 20 minutes or half hour late. She said, I can just sense the animosity in the eyes rolling. But when a man says, I'm going to be late for a meeting tomorrow, it's just embraced, understood, okay. And I'm hoping that, this pandemic has maybe leveled that playing field a little bit, that this, that men and women, and especially in families, have had to take on equal roles. And it's been more accepted that, that if you have to take care of your family for the first part of a day, that it's okay to do that. And that
yet
no matter whether you're a woman or a man.
And the research is telling us, at least what I read so far, and is that if you're looking at professional accomplishments and careers, this is disproportionately affecting women because of the child care and caretaking.
Yes, absolutely.
responsibilities.
Yeah. Tony?
Well, I think about personal values. Mary says it all the time, but it's about doing what you know is the right thing to do, even if people don't agree or don't. It's viewed as the worst possible decision. That to me drives me, in spite of the fact that it may not be popular. Again, I have learned to do a better job of building consensus around what's the right thing to do, but I'm like a dog with a bone when it comes to that. And being a caregiver, being someone who grew up as a healer, that's still very much a part of who I am, in terms of making sure that the people that are around me are that I do what's right, the right thing to do for them, whether it was a patient or a student or a faculty member now, or a colleague or a cabinet member. It's knowing, sticking to what feels right inside. One of the things I said to my daughter growing up, even as a mother, is to say to her, and I say to her now, I say, let your heart lead the way. The intellect is really important, and you understand the intellect and you take that into consideration, but let your heart lead the way, because that's when you know it's the right thing to do. So from a value point of view, that's why I think I was so drawn to Regis and I never left. I mean, I as well grew up as a young woman. I went to an all-girl high school, Catholic high school, went into a profession that, unlike Mary, was, well, teaching is all women for the most part, many, but in nursing, there was much more opportunity for leadership because it was a predominantly woman's profession. But moving up into the ranks that I've ended up in was not necessarily a woman's role either. But the fact was I was drawn to Regis because of the values of the university, the values of the sisters, and I'm still drawn and live every day. My leadership is so informed by the welcoming all without distinction and letting my heart lead the way to make sure I live that and lead with that. And the other is excellence tempered by gentleness, truly understanding that excellence is what we want, but at the end of the day, we can do it gently. That's what the woman side of us is expecting the best, but supporting people to be able to become the best, not about, well, you either win or you lose, or you either fail or you succeed. No, it's everyone should be offered the opportunity to win, to succeed and reach for the stars, but our job is to support that success, and that's the gentle side of it. It's not letting someone be successful by doing less, but it's by supporting them and giving them the opportunities that they deserve to be successful. And I think that's what has always drawn me so much to Regis and being 35 years. I've never in my wildest dreams would I've ever expected that. But I would also say to you that Regis has given me so many opportunities. Yes, I was a troublemaker. Yes, I was always saying we should do things differently, we can do better. But at the same time, similar to Audrey, they'd say, well, then go ahead and you do it. We'll give you the job and you go ahead and do it. And I was like, okay. So I was oftentimes offered the opportunity to do what I said needed to get done. And daunting as it might have been, scary as it might have been, those were the opportunities I was given. So from a values point of view, it's know what's the right thing, do the right thing. And if you realize that it's not the right thing, that you're willing to accept that but let your heart lead the way. That's where I'm at. And that's why the new building on campus has those two major sayings as my two favorite ones that have helped me in my leadership and continue to lead the way for me.
Great. Thank you.
I answered the fourth question.
That's okay. That's all right. Audrey?
Yeah, so I'm still formulating my thoughts here, but so I try to find meaning in all my work, and usually that is jobs that I think advance the collective good and that make a better world. And I'll embarrass Denise, the associate director for the Center of Inclusive Excellence. She always says, I'm building a better world for my child. And I think of all of our students as our children and the next generation, which kind of leaves the idea that this world is not perfect, right? So, it's not going to be perfect for me. So, just building for the next generation. So, I do think that in roles like ours, where we are supporting students, faculty, and staff, that it's hard to have that balance where, to be a parent or to have that, so be more mindful of that sort of work-life balance of yourself and those who work for you. When a student calls you and you're on vacation, the student's in crisis, you're going to answer the phone, right? So so I know, and so I know, Mary, you mentioned the authenticity. But sometimes I found that when I was a practicing attorney, and I found that I would use my femininity intentionally in different situations. I wouldn't say that was inauthentic of me, but it was more recognizing the stereotypes that existed against me and in my favor, and using them to benefit my client. And that sort of one story that sticks out to me in law school is that I had a professor tell me, with a smile like that, no one's going to care what's coming out of your mouth. And so I was like, well, that's pretty awful of you. So, but I took that with me. And so, when in a trial, working with the jury, I would, play up that, wear lipstick, play up everything, because it served what I thought was the collective good. And I didn't think it was inauthentic, and it served my ultimate value and goals in life, is to make a better world for everyone. So, and that, that sentiment has continued. So, in terms of picking your battles. And so as President Hayes said, even if you have to make a decision that's not something you think is right, is it serving your ultimate goal in the end? And being mindful of that. I do hope that in the near future, there will be less of that internal struggle. And as you mentioned, Mary, the impact of the pandemic on primary caregivers has been more acute than with others. And it will be interesting to see what happens when sort of we return to quote unquote normal, and what stays and what's remaining, and acknowledging the people of lives outside of work. So that was not an answer to your question, but all of your responses got me to thinking.
Yes, that's wonderful. Well, I'm going to continue with you, Audrey, because my next question is really about advice that you would give your younger self. And well, in your case, you have two young girls. So in retrospect, would you have done anything differently? And are there any lessons in your trajectory thus far that you would pass on or share with your daughters?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, that's always tough to to say, because I like where I am now, to say, what would I do differently, right?
Mhm.
But it would probably be something around the idea of self-management and making sure that you know where your boundaries are, you know how to set those for yourself, but also advocate for yourself, and have that strength to do so and to advocate for what you need, not just professionally, but personally. And so I probably tell them to do that a lot younger, to develop those skills.
Mhm.
I tell my daughter all the time, she wants something of her teacher, I was like, well, you ask her for it. You have to do that. It's not my role to tell your teacher what you need. You can do that.
Wonderful. Mary, do you have any advice that you would give your younger self, or would you have done anything differently?
Well, it's interesting that those are they're two different questions, and the done anything differently. I'm a firm believer, as probably everybody else is, that you learn as much, if not more, from your mistakes and how you handle the crises and curveballs that come your way. So although there are things that you think, gee, I'm not thrilled that happened, I wouldn't be the person I am today if it hadn't. So, there are very few things that I'd let go. But I was thinking about this, and I thought, one of the things that happens with a narrative like this is we put it together into these events and it all makes sense. And I think both Tony and I have kind of said, we didn't really think it was going to work out this way. Like this kind of happened along the way. And I think one of the things that I have valued more and more as my career and life has progressed is you savor and you plan for and you work for the big events and the big milestones. And I've had my share of those, those moments that you can say, yes, I did this, or I accomplished this, or whatever. This is something I can really be proud of. My advice to my younger self is, and more important in the end, and just as important, are the daily wins, the daily miracles. You and I have talked about this, but the little moments of connection and insight, because that really is what impels you through. And that's what gets you through all of those other things. And realizing that sooner than later, there are that many more of them for you to appreciate and savor. So yeah, it's the daily miracles.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mary. Tony?
Well, I grew up everyone in the same era as Mary. Moved to a suburban neighborhood, and it was like moving into Leave It to Beaver neighborhood. And I was the only one in my daughter's class, only parent in my daughter's class that kept her maiden name. I was really unusual. I didn't fit in. Even if I wasn't working full time, I was very, very committed and very involved in my career. I probably worked full time, even though I was getting paid part time, which is typical of women who work part time, right? But I think for me, I was so determined to figure out how to do it all that I sacrificed a lot of me. And it took me a while to figure that out. I'm still figuring it out. Because I was the super mom, and a busy person always says yes to doing more, right? Right, ladies? And so here I was working full time, raising 3 children, still the room parent for all 3 most of the time, head of the parent PTO. And I oftentimes look back on, and by the way, earning my doctorate in the midst of all of the child rearing, I often look back and say, how the heck did I ever do that? It takes its toll. And so that's one of the things that I would, and I've said that to my daughter, is you've got to take care of yourself, find time for yourself, make time for yourself. And you don't have to be a superwoman. So that's the kind of thing that I think. I didn't have role models, though, that showed me how I could do it better. And so that's what I would say to my younger self.
Yeah, you have a daughter and 2 granddaughters.
Mhm.
That's what I love about Venmo these days. So when someone asks me to do something or volunteer, I just Venmo them $20 for craft supplies.
And check that off the box. Oh my gosh, that's great. I have one more question for you, and then we have at least one or two questions in the chat box. And I encourage those who are attending to certainly think about a question or two and add it to the chat box. But my last question is, would you please name one person you admire most in this world and why? So I'll begin with Audrey.
Well, that's a hard thing to name one person. You know, I think Ayanna Pressley's doing amazing work and speaking truth to power and sharing her mind and smashing and highlighting and elevating other women who are smashing the cement ceiling. And so she would be one person.
Great. Thank you. I agree. Mary?
You know, it's like the daily miracles. I feel like I have every day I have more heroes, and they're not all famous people or people that you would know. It could be somebody that you meet and you have a conversation. You think, boy, they're handling that in a way I wouldn't have thought of. I can really learn from that. So, but that said, the person that I always come back to as among several mentors I had, but one that I thought, and she's no longer alive, but she was really influential and a wonderful friend, was Dorothy Ann Kelly, a member of the Ursuline Order and the former president of the College in Urshel, a seminal leader in higher education in the late 60s, 70s, 80s, actually ended up as a trustee of TIA-CREF, you know, as a Catholic president, woman religious. She was a great friend, but she had tremendous vision and great courage. And I remember at one point I had a professional setback and I sort of called her and was sort of sheepishly telling her about it and saying, and she totally dismissed it. And she said, you know, there isn't one of us that hasn't had something like that happen. It's what you do now, dear. You know, it's what you do now. How are you going to handle that? And it's really one of the best pieces of advice I ever got. And so I think of people like that I have been fortunate to meet who have really been, you know, leaders in their field, but took the time to sort of share some of that. And that was just a great opportunity.
Thank you, Mary. Tony?
This was so hard for me because I've had both men and women mentors in my life. And as I thought of some that have passed away that were so significant to my life and who I admired tremendously. But if I think about people who I admire today that also influence who I am and what I do, I would have to say Paul Farmer, and I have to put together with him Ophelia Dahl. As a pair and as they founded Partners in Health, and their collective commitment to the poor and the rights of the poor. No is never an option with them, which, you know, now that becomes my mantra. No is not an option. And in every way, as they serve the needs of the poor around the world, in the United States and around the world, in sacrificing their lives and sacrificing their personal lives as well as their physical lives. It's always where there's a will, there's a way, and the right thing is going to get done. So I have to say that today they are two people that I admire beyond, and I had frequently referred to Paul Farmer as the male version of Mother Teresa, and I really still believe that. So that's who they are for the moment.
Thank you. So we have a few questions from those attending. One question is, have you had a time or two in your life when you felt that your confidence was undermined, or you undermined your confidence in some way or another? And what strategies did you use to return, you know, to that place of having more confidence?
I'm going to jump in right away, and because it's happened to me more than once, and throughout my career. And again, most of my jobs, I was the first at doing something. So I was frequently viewed as somewhat of a threat, or who is she? What is she planning to do? What does she think she's doing? And so there was frequently a battle, but not really, but that undermining battle. And I would have to, honestly, in the years that I really thought that I just wasn't going to be able to get through it and deal with it, I took a mental health day. And I stayed home for a whole day, and I just thought it through and recharged and built the strength I needed again to go back and continue the journey. So I can't say that I've done that more recently. Maybe I should. But I have to say to you that sometimes the best thing you can do when you're feeling undermined or you're not making headway and you don't feel that people are behind you, you have to sometimes just step back and regroup and take a deep breath and recharge so that you can go back with the energy that you need and the confidence that you need to continue to move forward with your vision and the journey that you've set for yourself.
Thank you.
That's great, Tony. I was going to give a very different example. 20 years ago, I was sort of diagnosed out of the blue with ovarian cancer and had to have surgery and chemo and take a medical leave and was pretty sick, and knock on wood, I'm here. So I am very much a survivor. And that was a very transformational experience. And when I went back to work, like a lot of people and people now that are struggling with COVID, there were a lot of pretty profound after effects of the chemo and so it was the first time I had ever played hurt. It was the first time I'd ever had to do my job. And here I'd gotten this leave and it was paid. And so I felt like I really had to be back as soon as I could. And when I went back, I mean, there were days I literally had to lie down in the office to get the strength to walk home. And I would say to the students, I'm really good at names and I cannot remember a single proper name now, I mean, with the chemo fog. And I think it was, so I was sort of undermined by my own health in that sense. And it was a very humbling experience. And I think one of those things that you realize how lucky you have been not to have to fight those battles every day. And it leaves you with a level of understanding for people who do, and yourself, that thank goodness has never gone away. But, I had never had that level of hampering of my own abilities and frustration. And it was something to go through and was not a bad thing.
Thank you for sharing that. It's so, and I can't even imagine that, how that must feel to live your life and then have this sort of, the awareness of sort of this cloud in front of your capacity and your intelligence. But my example is more recent, and it's the Zoom world. And then I'm used to talking to people in the room and getting immediate feedback, where it be body language or eye contact. And so sometimes you feel like you're talking to your computer screen. Is anyone understanding this? What's going on? And that is really undermines your confidence. I should also say I hate talking about myself. So I don't know if you could, I like advocating for other people all day, every day. I'll fight for, and I won't cry at all. But as soon as I talk about myself, you hear my voice. So sorry about that. But my first meeting at Regis, I thought I was talking to no one. And then, is anyone hearing me? And then I get text messages that start to Kara Kolomitz, great job. And then all of you on the screen, that was great. Okay, well, this is what's like working for a matriarchy, where people actually compliment to one another. So that was pretty great. I'm not really crying. I do this all the time.
Audrey warned me. She said, when I start talking about myself, I start to cry. I think it's because she's just, Audrey Grace is so full of grace. It's hard for her to. talking
And
point.
I joke that I'm a terrible I'm terrible in salary negotiations because I just start crying.
Another question in the chat is, how does Regis support initiatives from women on campus? I mean, I think we do that in many, many different ways, but maybe if you all could just share some ways in which we do that.
I think the majority of the leadership are women.
Yeah.
Um,
I
So,
think- No, I think the president's, just said, Tony just said it earlier. I mean, that there's a great capacity and a great willingness to support new ideas and changes. And I mean, I feel like I've landed in the middle of that, and that's very much in the DNA of the place. So I think the question is, people are given leadership opportunities to do that. And maybe we can do better on following up or networking or supporting or whatever, but I don't feel that there's a set of barriers that people have to jump through, certainly relative to other places that I've worked.
Mm.
Good, Tony.
I think that's a good question too, because someone was asking if, do we have a women's center on campus? And their frame was, well, no, this is a very female dominated institution. But, I think it would be interesting to do more externally and to promote the women leaders that we have among us, and to help them make an impact outside of, and I think they do, but and how can we support them as an institution, I think would be a great project to look into.
And Tony, you were saying that we're predominantly, in terms of leadership, dominated by women. How do you see that as influencing the culture at Regis?
Oh, it's clear to me that it creates a great deal of energy. It adds challenge, actually, but it's a welcomed challenge. There are days when I'm exhausted by it, but I welcome it because I think it's what generates the innovation, and it's what generates the vision that is why Regis has done well. I mean, it's always been led by women. The cabinet has not been as heavily influenced by women in more as it is now. But in the end, it's about supporting relationships and the energy that we can continue to encourage and mentoring women, all the way from the female student on through to the cabinet. And I will say to you, and I've said this before, when Regis made the choice and decision to go co-educational, I became the president of just a few years after that. And I continued to meet with alums who were still struggling with that. And I could reassure them and assure them that while an all-women's college empowers young women, and it's definitely an empowering environment, but at Regis, we're now empowering young men in an environment where women are empowered.
Mm-hmm.
And that's our job now, is to make sure those guys are ready for a woman boss.
Right. Well, I think that's a perfect.
I should just, there's a plug,
Go ahead,
there's a guys' night tonight that Dan Leahy is running. It's
Right.
anyone who identifies as a guy, and there's going to be barbecue for those who are listening.
Right.
Great.
They have
And the men on this campus understand exactly what I'm saying. And we are empowering them in an environment where women are also empowered. And that's, I think, going to set our young men up to be much better prepared for the world that they're going to be entering.
Absolutely. I think that's a perfect ending to this session. I want to thank you all so very much for your willingness to really open your hearts and offer insights into your own personal journeys and your thoughts around leadership at Regis and leadership in general. So thank you so very much. And I also want to give a special shout out and thank you to Denise Mashmashani, who was the visionary behind this panel and all her efforts in organizing it. So thank you, Denise. And thanks to everybody who attended. As we continue to celebrate Women's History Month, we are really just proud to be here at Regis and being with each other among women, among men, always though serving the dear neighbor without distinction.